Welcome everyone this evening. We're so happy to have you all here. My name's Nikki. I'm the manager of education and marketing, and I'm going to take just a couple of minutes and then I'll hand the whole thing over to Freeman. So this is the topic of this presentation is show me the meaning of being lonely, loneliness, and you. We were really excited to bring this topic forward because it is really hitting a lot of people these days. So we hope that you take this presentation in, and even if you just get one or two things that impacts your life, or if you're an RCC, you can move with your clients. That's great. So I will quickly say these Matters of the Mind presentations are free events for the public and also RCCs on mental health topics to help people within the province sustain themselves just a little bit better. And what we do with these presentations is we highlight one of our members and bring forward their expertise. So today we have got Freeman Woolnough. So Freeman, there's Freeman. So Freeman is a counselor with over 15 years experience. He's worked alongside people in a variety of educational and community-based settings. Freeman's an avid reader and singer and hiker and learner. And I'm thrilled to have Freeman here to do this. It's been a lot of fun working with you, Freeman, to make this happen.
Thank you.
Before I hand this whole thing over, I want to acknowledge the lands that I'm coming from today. So I'm coming from the beautiful sunny lands of the Lekwungen speaking people, known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations. And if you are inclined, you can absolutely place where you're coming from in the chat to acknowledge the lands that we are all coming from throughout the province. And with that, the show is to you, Freeman, and thank you all for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Nikki, and thank you everybody for joining us. Very exciting. I will note as well as you came in, Nikki and I was talking about this. The video, your video was off. Some of you have already turned your video on. Please feel free to share your video or not. We were talking about this earlier. That I was trying to find some sort of research because we're all so online post-pandemic and during the pandemic, and some research on like, is it better to be showing our videos because that means that you feel less lonely because you see all these people, or is it not as good because it kind of emphasizes that we're all in these little boxes and distance from each other? And turns out there's no really big research on it right now. So if you feel so inclined, turn your video on. If you don't want to turn your video on, totally fine. I will also note that there are some settings in Zoom, and it really depends on your own device, that allow you to just look at me as a presenter, that allow you to look at the slides, the shared screen, and also that allow you to look at kind of all the little boxes of people. So feel free to play around with that if things are so inclined for you. My final note before I move on to the next slide is just that I am currently in my small wee child's bedroom. He's just under 2 years old and he is just outside the door. And it's entirely possible at some point I might need to take a 30-second break to calm my child down. But I think we should be okay. That all being said, let's move on a little bit to some things. As Nikki mentioned, important to acknowledge the lands that we're on, and I'm just going to recognize that I am currently located on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am living uninvited on this land, and one of the things I appreciate about living in this part of the world, so I'm in Vancouver, is the ability to access some pretty amazing nature, from the beaches to the forests. We're going to touch briefly on the importance of nature later on in the presentation. And while we all know that these are in danger of being wiped out, these environmental kind of areas, I do think it's really important to recognize that Indigenous peoples have been caretaking this land since before time immemorial, for which I am very grateful. That all being said, who am I? So my name is Freeman. Nikki gave a wonderful introduction. That's kind of my little mini bio. I'm a counselor. I've been working for over 15 years in the field in a variety of kind of areas and domains. In addition to that, as Nikki mentioned, I'm other things. I am a father, I'm a partner, I'm a friend, and much, much more. And more than everything else, I know Nikki mentioned this is an opportunity for experts to share their things. I'm not an expert in loneliness, so I'll just say that right here. But I've been very interested in the topic. It comes up a lot. I've worked with university populations in particular for a chunk of the last 15 years. Comes up a lot, and so this presentation is partly informed by a quite deep dive into literature and research. And also some of the information that I'm going to be presenting comes out just simply of some discussions with a number of colleagues, including Doctors Kimberly Brownlee and Francis Chen, both of whom study various facets of loneliness at UBC. So what to expect just over the next 50 minutes or so. We're going to talk, of course, just briefly about what is loneliness, just so that we can kind of ground ourselves in what that is. Do you want to chat a bit about this big thing, the pandemic that happened, because there are some impacts, and I think we're still seeing some impacts from that. And the majority of this is going to be focused on things that we can do, because I think that's a big chunk of why people are here. It's nice to acknowledge what loneliness is. It's nice to acknowledge that things have happened. How do we move forward, either individually or as a community? So as we move along, one of the things that I've kind of done at the end of this presentation is draw out some kind of key action items that we can be doing in a variety of ways around loneliness. And so I encourage you, whether that's jotting some things down, just thinking to yourself, popping some things into the chat as we move along, some ideas that pop up for you. What can we do for ourselves when we're experiencing loneliness? What could we do for others that might help with loneliness? Right? What can we do as a community? And there's a reference at the end that talks about some things coming out of the UK. UK is really taking a focus on programming models, community programming models, specifically for the older generation, kind of 50, 55, 60 plus. If you are in that area and you're like, that doesn't apply to me, I'm not older and yet I'm 55, surprise. But they really focus on community programs. So I'm not going to delve specifically into a lot of community programming. However, if something pops up for you that, hey, this might be useful to kind of develop a program or to help out with the community, not just specific individuals, pop it in the chat or think to yourself, jot those things down. And then finally, as Nikki mentioned, I know there's a number of RCCs, Registered Clinical Counselors, who are therapists. And so I am myself as well there. So certainly feel free to take some of the information that I'm sharing and morph it into what some interventions might look like or some things to consider when a client presents in front of you with some aspect of loneliness. So I found this picture and I was like, oh my gosh, that's a picture for sure. We do want to talk about what is loneliness. And so before I hop into what kind of the literature says on this, I want to do a bit of engagement. And so there are some opportunities throughout this session to engage a little bit that can be really intense for people, and so it's absolutely voluntary. What we're just going to do right now is it's an anonymous online polling for some questions around loneliness. There's two of them, and so Nikki's just going to pop into the chat here some information about a website called Mentimeter. I'm just going to pop it up right here. And so if you happen to be able to, and it's okay if not, if you're not able to access this directly, just feel free to think about these questions on your own. But if you happen to have a phone nearby or just on the computer there, feel free to pop in those numbers at the top at menti.com. And the first question is, over the past month, I've felt lonely. How much? All right, so option number one is not at all. Number two, sometimes. Number two, a lot. And number four is constantly. And what I like about this particular website is the animations, and we have these little bubbles popping up there. And so we can really see where people are landing on this. Again, this is anonymous. And I think that this is not super surprising, given that everyone's here to talk about loneliness. There's some aspects, again, some people are looking to support others, and many people do happen to, experience loneliness. Right? And we know from the research that most people will experience loneliness. In fact, from the US, the Surgeon General recently noted that at any given time, 1 out of every 2 people, 50% of people, are experiencing some form of loneliness. That's a lot to me. And we can see the majority of people on this call, or at least who are responding, are saying sometimes, right? And a few people a lot, and even a few people constantly, and of course a few not at all. And that's also just over the past month. So feel free to continue answering that question. I'm just going to move on to the next one, which is, what is a word? And I think I gave you the option to fill in 2. What is one word that comes to mind when I say loneliness? So if this next question isn't showing up quite yet, there might be a little button on your phone or on the website, or there you go, you have some people who found it. Feel free to refresh the website as well. Sometimes that's useful. So we have a nice little word cloud developing here. We have the cold, empty sadness. So the cool thing about word cloud graphics is that the more certain words are shared, the more they are emphasized in the word cloud. So the bigger the word is. So we have disconnected, we have sadness, isolated, empty, alone. And then we also have kind of some smaller ones there in terms of depression, cold, alienation, sad. Again, not connection. Connection is a very big one here, not surprising. Invisible, very much true for sure. I will notice I see some hands being raised. Nikki's gathering questions, so feel free to put to private chat to her with some questions, and we'll kind of gather some. If we have some time at the end, we'll note them. But I just wanted to kind of touch on this question to get us again grounded in what is loneliness before kind of moving on. Feel free to continue popping that in, and when we might be able to send out kind of the graphic a bit later to folks as well to get a sense of that. So let's get back to what we're talking about, which is loneliness. Because you didn't come here to share your answers, you came here to hear someone talk at you a little bit, hopefully. So this is welcome to loneliness. And just, Nikki, can you just nod? Am I back in the PowerPoint presentation? Yes, I am. Amazing. So what is loneliness? There's a lot of things out there, and I'd like to thank artificial intelligence for providing us with this particular definition. Which comprises a lot of different things from the research. So it's the subjective, unwelcome feeling that occurs when there's a discrepancy between a person's actual and desired relationships with others, such as the quality of relationships or the lack of a particular relationship. Before we move on, I think for me, it's always important to note that all emotions do serve a purpose. When we feel angry, it tells us in some way, shape, or form that we're being disrespected, or we're perceiving an aspect of disrespect in some way. Anxiety tells us that there's something that we might need to escape, whether that's real or not, whether we're able to or not. Ideally, therefore, loneliness also has a purpose. And realistically, the purpose of loneliness is to tell us that there's some sort of change needed in our connection with others in some way. That's not necessarily the easiest of tasks, mind you, but just really important to remind ourselves that this feeling is telling us something. In the research, there is kind of a difference between, they differentiate between 2 types of loneliness. Social loneliness, which is the perceived absence of social networks. So this is loneliness that exists irregardless of if you actually have close personal relationships or not. It's when we don't have the opportunities to be social. So groups, clubs, sense of belonging things. Even if we don't have connections, social loneliness, or even if we do have connections, social loneliness can still kind of exist. This is most evident when we're moving to new places. So all of a sudden we're kind of distanced from our actual network. If you happen to live in a rural area where you didn't grow up in originally, that sense of kind of when you first moved there, that would be a bit of social loneliness. This one is often connected to social isolation. That's versus emotional loneliness, which is the perceived absence of close connection. So, for example, with partners, family, friends, there is a connection between social anxiety and emotional loneliness. It's a correlation, not necessarily an absolute causation there. And we're going to focus a little bit more on the emotional loneliness side of things. Social loneliness, in terms of what can be done, it's a lot of, becoming okay with where we're at, and of course that's easier said than done, but it's, finding, well, all the things we're told in college, university, like find a group, join a club, get yourself out there, actually start finding those opportunities for social networks. Versus emotional loneliness, there tends to actually be a lot more that we can do on the individual level for that. The one thing before we move on that I'd like to just kind of note is the emphasis here on the perceived absence of close connection, the perceived absence of social networks. Loneliness is a lot around perception. And we're going to talk about this in a moment, and you're going to hear me say this again and again and again. The internet is so bad for this because our perceptions have been skewed so much, in particular by social media. And that's irregardless of your age and stage in life, but our perceptions of ourselves in particular and what our expectations are of ourselves have been skewed so much by that. So that's a little bit about what loneliness is. I'm going to take a wee bit of a pause from me chatting at you here. And I'm going to have 3 spots in this presentation where I'm going to present a question. This is a bit of an activity from something called, it depends on where you're looking at, but it's a Fast Friends project or a Fast Friends experience. The idea is if you were to do this kind of like speed dating for friends type of program, which is certainly an idea for community-based programming, where there's a list of, and it's fairly prominent on the internet, speaking of getting off the internet, but 36 questions. 12, 12, 12, 3 stages, each getting a little bit more deeper and deeper and deeper. The idea is that you can go through these questions in around 90 minutes or so with someone, and that the research has shown that it actually creates some nice deep connection, which of course, creating connection helps to counteract this feeling of emotional loneliness. So I'm going to put up a question here, and I encourage you to either think about it, jot it down for yourself, or even pop it into the chat, your answer to this, if you're feeling uber brave. And there's no shame whatsoever for people who aren't. But given the choice of anyone in the world, whom would you want as a dinner guest, or as we say in the Maritimes, a supper guest? I'm not in the Maritimes right now, but I grew up there. So again, this is kind of stage 1, getting to know people. This isn't the only question on the list, but I'm just going to take a quick moment for you to have a quick look in the chat if people are popping some things in there. I see a few there. And just feel free to share. This is where I'm also going to tease this idea that if you happen to see something pop up in the chat that you're like, hey, that's interesting. Oh, that would be interesting for me. Or, oh, I'm curious about why. Or, hey, like, I also would want to have that person as a dinner guest. Feel free you have my permission to private message that person and say, hey, that's kind of cool. I'm okay as I present if you're having side chats in the background. That's totally fine by me. Because again, part of this idea is to join us a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about Fast Friends toward the end of the presentation. So who would you like as a dinner guest? That's the question. That being said, let me move on as you continue to have your side chats, and maybe I just totally made things go off the rails there, but let's talk about the impact of this pesky little thing and large thing that we call the pandemic. It happened a few years ago, continued for a number of years. There are still effects that are definitely impacting us. When we talk about loneliness when it comes to the pandemic, even though we often focus on older people when it comes to loneliness, interestingly, the younger population actually expressed higher rates of loneliness during the pandemic and after the pandemic. So people over the age of 50, 55, we have always seen high levels of loneliness during the pandemic. We see people under the age of 25, 20, also experienced even higher rates of loneliness and continue to be more lonely for the most part than their older peers. Also, people who were single and or divorced and or widowed throughout the pandemic, that was a fairly big indicator of loneliness. We've seen some lifestyle changes certainly in the pandemic, but in terms of after the pandemic, those who were the loneliest during the pandemic, still to this day, sleep less, have different eating patterns, both up or down, depending on the person, less physical activity, and an increased use of phone, internet, TV, and news consumption. There were a lot of really big things that happened during the pandemic specifically, and we really all latched onto the news. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a lot of that consumption. We noticed that people who were the loneliest tend toward these patterns much more even today. The US Surgeon General, many of you might be familiar, about 2 years ago, it came up with a big report basically talking about how loneliness is an epidemic. And actually noted in that report that loneliness itself is associated with increased mortality. Of course, there's a lot of things between A to Z there, but increased mortality, and that again increased loneliness through the pandemic, therefore increased mortality, not just as a result of disease and illness. And again, this is really alarming because 1 in 2 people experience loneliness at any given time. And then finally, and I think for me most, in all honesty, interesting and important, is the pandemic influenced negatively, in my opinion, and according to the research as well, our ability to communicate. And it's actually still impacting negatively our ability to communicate offline. I'll say again, get off the internet. Not right now, because this is a wonderful presentation that you should be watching, but get off the internet. It's not great. It's also, our ability to communicate has been hampered because the pandemic, in particular in North America, has increased the acceptance socially of social isolation. It's now become a little bit more okay, and in many ways that can be a good thing in terms of focusing in on what we need, what our own needs are. However, that is also known to increase our felt sense of loneliness. Interesting and possibly related note, just something that I kind of found. Many people here are working in workplaces that may have work from home options, and many of those workplaces might see kind of, let's meet regularly, let's have these regular meetings, especially when we're working from home, especially during the pandemic, we saw that, but also after the pandemic, we see that continuing, that this idea of workplaces saying, okay, meetings are important because we're not all seeing each other face to face. So let's have these Zoom meetings. Let's have meetings a bit more regularly. Interestingly, there's actually a fair bit of evidence showing that people who attend more meetings report more loneliness. Still TBD to be determined in terms of why that may be. However, if you happen to be someone who is a manager or who is, making the schedules for people, keep that in mind, that more meetings tends to increase more loneliness. So big impact of the pandemic. That's not necessarily, a pandemic pulls up a lot of feelings for a lot of people. So let's talk just briefly about some protective factors, about what helps protect us against loneliness. I'm going to briefly look at this. This is a big, long list, okay? And I want to just note up front that there are very few people who check every single box on this list. And also, if you are someone who checks every single box on this list, you can still experience loneliness. These are just factors. This doesn't necessarily mean they are determinants. A lot of things on there, right? I'm not going to go through every single one here. Feel free to read. I will just note, I don't have gender on here. There are, interestingly, some gender differences, but they actually seem to intersect a fair bit with ability status, so as well as age. Altogether, those three. So there's no one specific gender that experiences loneliness more or less when we look across the board. But for example, someone who identifies as male, who has a disability and who is over the age of 60 may experience that might be very different than someone who is trans, who is 16, who is able-bodied. And there's a lot of intersections with gender in particular, making it kind of difficult to say for sure this one gender tends to be more lonely or less lonely. Being white, that's specifically for communities such as North America, Europe, and Canada, US in particular, where we're surrounded by other white people. Interestingly, still today, the lowest levels of community engagement in the United States are in the South, where slavery and Jim Crow laws were most prominent, and that's lowest levels of community engagement and highest levels of loneliness, experienced levels of loneliness. I was going to take a little bit of water. You'll see extroversion on this list. And if you identify as an extrovert or high extroversion, which most counselors do not, but if you do, you're probably like, yay, that's great. The one exception when extroversion is actually a risk factor for loneliness is when big social change occurs. For example, a pandemic. So we actually noticed that people higher on extroversion during the pandemic, actually, the loneliness experience was influencing them a lot more with that big social change. I already noted the age thing, so we typically more risk of loneliness would be under 18s as well as over 50s. Despite a lot of research showing that both younger and older people experience loneliness at a similar rate, older people do have higher risks of loneliness due to a lot of the other factors on this list that can be confounding, and also kind of again some confounding factors there because loneliness is often contributing to or contributing from some significant grief as we get older in life, for example. You'll notice I'll just highlight again limited internet use, especially social media. If we are limiting that, that is a protective factor, not cutting it out entirely, but it is important. There's one thing that's not on this list that I haven't included on this, but I'm about to pop up here that is actually one of the major protective factors against loneliness. And I think, pardon the language, but I think it's a bunch of BS that they include this on the list because it's having good and lasting relationships with at least a few friends or family members. And I think that's a little silly as something that could be considered a protective factor because it goes both ways, right? We typically feel lonely, again, that emotional loneliness when we don't feel that we have good connection with others, when we don't perceive that we have relationships. That being said, if we're on the lookout for people who are at higher risk, people who don't necessarily have those in-depth relationships or feel that they don't have those in-depth relationships. So without any further ado, let's move on to the actual content around how we can potentially counter loneliness. So I'm going to go through a bunch of slides with a bunch of different concepts that are all related to countering loneliness in some way, shape, or form. We got a lot of interest based on the call out on this particular first topic, which is the idea of FOMO versus JOMO. My little toddler loves to say JOMO right now. I don't know why. I don't think he knows what it means, but he loves to say it. So FOMO, many people might have heard about this before, or the fear of missing out. It's essentially anxiety or stress that other people are doing things or having more fun than us. There is in the research a fair bit. The concept of FOMO has existed for a while now. So there has been some research, and there's a connection to loneliness. High FOMO typically equals high loneliness. Interestingly, also, there's a connection between FOMO and, for example, problematic drinking behaviors. In fact, high FOMO can actually predict problematic drinking behaviors even more than some other psychological measures out there, especially for university populations. As we all know, that's who we study the most, so that tends to be who we can say it is true about the most. FOMO was heightened during the pandemic across the board. And it is often attributed to social media use, not necessarily lots of social media use. So it's not necessarily decreasing the amount of social media use, but mindless social media use, the kind of what we call doom scrolling or just kind of going to things by default. One of my colleagues, when I was working in Ontario, used to say for a bit, we tend to compare our insides to other people's outsides. What we see on social media is a highlight reel. And that highlight reel and almost inevitably is more positive, more upbeat, more social than what we sometimes are feeling inside. But our brains find it difficult to contrast the two in an appropriate way. And so we think everyone's having fun. But the reality is they might not necessarily be having as much fun, or we might actually be experiencing similar things, but our insides are being compared to their outsides. And so it's hard for our brains to distinguish those two. That being said, let's talk about JOMO. Okay, what is JOMO? The joy of missing out is essentially kind of the opposite, but not really. Being present and okay with where we are at. I found this fascinating. It was the term itself was first coined by a blogger named Anil Dash in 2012, when he kind of noted this realization that he'd rather be present during his son's bath time than doing anything else, and finding joy in that, even though he was missing out on a number of other social activities. If there are a number of things that can help us practice JOMO. It's not simply a case of saying, just don't worry, just be present and just be okay. One of the biggest things, surprise, surprise, turn off the internet. But of course, that's not really possible at all times. Interestingly, there actually is a bit of recent research looking at the joy of missing out, some JOMO, and actually shows that there's a connection between JOMO and social anxiety. People who experience JOMO tend to experience a little bit more social anxiety, which is kind of the opposite of what we'd hope. But if you look further into that research, it actually turns out that that connection is only there, particularly when people are trying to experience the joy of missing out by intentionally missing out on something social. So someone's invited them to something, or there's a group that they could go to. They miss out on that, and then they spend time looking at social media, including photos or posts about what the other people are doing. And so if you look at the research, that's where JOMO doesn't really happen, right? But that being said, two things that can be useful, even if you are online on social media use, could be asking yourself, what is the purpose? Not my purpose in life, that's probably poorly worded. What is the purpose of using this internet, of using this social media? What am I looking for here? Am I looking just for a brain dump? Am I looking for some relaxation? Am I looking for some ideas for decorating my house? Right? Just taking the time just to kind of check in with ourselves before or during or after, saying, what was the purpose of that? What was I looking to get out of that? Can actually really help us be present, right? Again, it's not saying absolutely no internet, but I suggest that. It's saying be present and try to not be judgmental about where we're at with that. The other thing that can be really helpful with JOMO across the board, not just with internet use, is recognizing our autonomy, our choice within these things. What I mean by that specifically is to recognize that when we say no to doing something, we're often saying no to doing something because we want to be saying yes to something else. And vice versa. If I'm saying yes to hopping on Instagram and just looking through my feeds, I'm saying no potentially to chatting with my partner. I'm saying no to sleeping. I'm saying no to a number of other things, but also vice versa. We're always not necessarily losing out on things, but recognizing that we are always actively making choice. So especially for those therapists out there on the call, helping people recognize the choice in what they're doing can often help bolster the joy of missing out in a good way that can really decrease our false sense of loneliness. So that's FOMO and JOMO. There's a fair bit. JOMO is still kind of new to the research field. FOMO not so much, but there's a few links in the resources at the end that we'll talk about. Another concept that I found really fascinating that Kimberly Brownlee is actually up at UBC is doing some research on right now is this concept of neededness. It doesn't need a lot of explanation in terms of what it is. It's exactly that. It's this concept that we are needed. And recent research has actually supported the idea that we should really try to focus on neededness in order to help counter feelings of loneliness. Those feel needed tend not to feel as lonely. That being said, as I'm sure many people realize, simply being told that you're needed or that you're an important part of this life is not enough. We have to genuinely feel needed in some capacity. Again, this idea of perception or self-perception and how we think things are is really important because people can tell us lots of things, but unless we actually are believing it for ourselves, it's not going to have much of an impact. That being said, I actually really like the concept of neededness because a lot of the aspects of loneliness have to do with actually connecting with other people, talking to previous connections, the connections that exist, making new connections. But when we talk about neededness, even without dependents or friends who naturally may need us, it's actually possible to build up a sense of neededness. So one example, which is out there, and I think this helps with I know it helps with a number of things, is volunteering. right? Volunteering in our community that can help other people with their loneliness, but also ourselves. That being said, the research actually says you need to be volunteering for specific reasons, not for very specific reasons, but if you're intentionally trying to basically fill a void of self-worth or saying, I I need to be a better person and I will be a better person by volunteering, this actually tends not to increase neededness and it tends not to decrease loneliness. But if we're looking to volunteer to truly help support others or even to make friends, because some people do the volunteering for that purpose explicitly, we actually do see loneliness decrease. So volunteering, yes, within those specific kind of frameworks. Even more interesting to consider, and here's where we touch on the fact that we don't really need other people necessarily to counter loneliness. Sure, we can be needed by people, but we can also feel needed by something bigger than us. So back on the list, you saw, religious affiliation is on the list of protective factors. So there's that. But similarly, we can actually increase our awareness and focus, for example, on the environment, in particular, environmental protection and sustainability, thus increasing our sense of I am needed in this world for this world. Believe it or not, this actually can increase our sense of neededness and therefore decrease loneliness without even necessarily needing people. One of the kind of things that can help counter loneliness is going for a walk in nature, doing a bit of a recycling drive, doing a beach cleanup. That actually can really help counter loneliness, even if you're doing it alone. And this is, I probably should have mentioned at the beginning, but loneliness is not being alone. We can be surrounded by people, but if we don't feel needed, if we don't feel that the quality of those relationships is there, we will still very much feel that emotional loneliness. Me talking at you a heck of a lot. Let's take a we talk and pause. Okay? This is level 2 fast friends. If you're still sticking with us, which it looks like most people are, whether you put it on mute and you're just in the background or whatever have you, in the chat, if you would like, feel free to answer this question, which is a level 2 fast friends question. So it's a bit more vulnerable, a bit more open. But the question is this: what do you value most in a friendship? What do you value most in a friendship? And this could be, what did you used to value in friendships? What do you value currently? What do you hope your friendships have, even if they do not? And again, the idea here is that we're just sharing, and I do give you permission, not that you need my permission for anything, but the guy in front has said, if you would like to private message someone being like, oh, that's kind of cool, me too. This is the start. This is the formation potentially of some awesome relationships. I don't know. Maybe someone's going to get married 10 years from now because of this presentation. That'd be cool, huh? Fun fact, I was telling Nikki this, I didn't know that I was going to call him up, but the person who married my wife and I is on this call. Anyway, moving on, speaking of fun facts, this idea of micro moments. I'm just going to share this quote from a researcher who wrote a book about love and a few other things and introduced this concept of micro moments. Her name is Barbara Fredrickson. I'll read it out. Emotions are responses to the ever-changing circumstances we find ourselves in. And if we try to have nonstop joy, it's not fitting our circumstances. What seems to matter, but our circumstances, again, are ever-changing. What seems to matter is the frequency of mild waves of positivity, not their duration or their intensity. So this idea that we're constantly looking to stay joyful, to stay happy, to stay unlonely, for example, Fredrickson kind of notes that that's not really possible. We're holding ourselves to impossible expectations. Rather, we look for those small bursts of positivity, of excitement, of connection. And within this, she talks about micro moments. Micro moments, she talks about them at first in terms of between romantic partners, but also them between friends, and then also a little bit between just kind of almost strangers in the community. And that's where I really want to latch onto this idea that micro moments are these small things that just give us that fleeting smile on our faces, that fleeting, like, oh, that connection really happened, that thing that happens that you come home and you think to yourself, ah, that person didn't have to do it, but they did, right? And these are things that can help with our loneliness and help with other people's. Micro moments do need to have 2 elements for them to happen. They need to be real time sensory felt. So that means not online, right? Get off the internet. They also have to have an element of perceived safety. So this is not harassing someone with your smile or harassing someone with a perhaps untoward comment about how they look or whatever have you. What it can look like, for example, though, is that passing smile or helping with the door, hold the door for someone, just those small little things. I will say, having lived in the Maritimes and now living in Vancouver specifically, I find it to me shocking how few people smile on the streets. My default is to have my head up, and that's my culture, my background, and my family. So my default is to have my head up and to be smiling generally, and then if someone looks away, then I'll kind of maybe stop. Versus I find people here, it's generally people aren't even looking at each other, or if they find you looking at it, they kind of look away. But even just that passing smile, when I'm able to share that, very fun, very cool. Again, it's a micro moment. Leaving a note for someone, right? Whether it's someone you know, someone you don't know, a note for someone in a store, your barber, a friend. This doesn't have to be huge letter writing, just a quick little note, like a little post-it on your office mate's door, right? Bring someone that you do know, ideally not a stranger, but like their favorite food or favorite snack or something that you'd like to share with them. And then, of course, this idea of just stopping to actually say hello and or just share some positive comments. Again, we want to get not into the harassing or sexual nature of comments, but just saying, hey, wow, I really like what you did right there, or that's really cool, what just happened. Thank you for that, right? This aspect of gratitude, this aspect of just small moments, you don't have to have full conversation, but micro moments can really help bolster and counter loneliness. You might be thinking to yourself, hey, this sounds kind of similar to acts of kindness. So yes, absolutely. Acts of kindness being a little bit bigger. There's a whole slew of research out there focused on altruistic behavior, so focusing on others and helping others, or what's called pro-social behavior. It's generally what altruism is, and acts of kindness. It's generally seen as really good, beneficial, and also as a protective factor against loneliness on both sides. I do an act of kindness for someone, I get benefit from it, and they get benefit from it, right? It's also, as a side note for everyone, completing pro-social behavior, acts of kindness, is actually protective around suicidality as well. Nice side bonus. In terms of acts of kindness, there's lots of stuff out there. I'm sure you've all had, heard of it, and there's lots of things on the internet you can look up in terms of what could be an act of kindness. The research, interestingly, supports that it's actually not best when it can be effective, but it's not very effective when it's truly random or anonymous. Right? So again, get off the internet for your acts of kindness, do something in person. You don't have to know the person. So it's not anonymous in terms of totally you have to know the person, but the person has to see you doing it, or you have to do it where the person can see it or feel it, or kind of they know that someone specifically is caring. So that's something you can keep in mind when we're talking about acts of kindness. That the random acts of kindness, nice, but they don't really help the loneliness side of things specifically. Our kind of final section here, and again, because it comes up so much for younger people, for older people, especially about throughout our lives, is this idea of developing and strengthening friendships. The number of people who report having 10 or more friends has decreased over the past 30 years. And the number of people who report having no close friends has increased by nearly 5 times. This has been exacerbated, of course, by the pandemic, and it also does continue as a lasting impact. There is some evidence that that a fear of rejection leads to self-fulfilling prophecy around friendships, developing them, especially when we're already feeling lonely. So when we're feeling lonely, it can lead to being a bit more anxious, again, social anxiety around developing new friendships, especially, or some anger around friendships that exist that aren't necessarily as great quality, both toward ourselves and toward others, that anger. Important to recognize, as I'm about to go through the next slide, but that I know I keep saying get off the internet. Yes, get off the internet. Technology can be used to facilitate in-person connection. When we use it as a starting point, that's really good. But if we're using it to replace in-person connection, this increases our loneliness. So get off the internet. Some things to consider when we're developing either new friendships or strengthening our own friendships. Connection is almost always fostered through openness. safe vulnerability. This doesn't mean that you have to share every single part of your life with every single person that you meet. What it does mean is that we do sometimes at certain points need to take a bit of a risk around sharing something maybe a bit more than just the weather today, or something a bit more than I'm fine, thanks, right? That's how we foster connection. And that's through people that we know, as well as through new relationships. That's the idea behind the fast friends kind of phenomenon, is going through those questions with people can actually really help us, lead us gradually in a safe way to being a bit more open. And again, safety is important within that realm of vulnerability. Important to recognize that due to the pandemic, a lot of our, even people who are older and not necessarily the youth, our social skills or our confidence in those social skills might actually be lower, right? So consider going back to the basics. How do we meet friends in elementary school? How do we meet friends in general? Just literally saying hello and building that confidence again in terms of just having basic conversations can really be important. And in particular, for example, for therapists, encourage people to assess their own ability or willingness to actually make and maintain friendships. Friendships take energy. And sometimes we do have a tendency to just think, I'm going to sit here and friends aren't coming to me. What's wrong? All right. We also need to invest. Sometimes also we're saying, I'm trying to invest energy and it's not happening. And that's important to look at as well. But looking at kind of, are my skills actually up there? And all of us need a little bit of a reset post-pandemic as well. Something I often encourage my clients with is to, if you're looking to develop new friends, there's this notion that, sometimes people say, I just need friends. But I tell my clients, my students, do you really want to be friends with someone who's an asshole? Because if you want to be friends with anybody, do you want anybody to be a friend, or are you actually looking for something specific? Ask yourself, who is my ideal friend? Make a bit of a list. You might not be able to get that in one person, but you might be able to get a group of friends, one who kind of meets you at your physical activity kind of requirements. I want to go running with someone who plays board games, someone who enjoys music, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And more importantly, for the starting components of making friends, where are you most likely to meet these people? One of my favorite things when I was working with university students, I shouldn't say favorite, it was actually quite sad in some ways, but first year students, sometimes would come into the office and they'd say, I really want to make friends, but I've been trying to make friends, but I haven't been able to meet anybody. And I say, okay, well, like, what's your ideal friend? They say, well, I kind of want someone who will like watch movies with me, kind of go maybe for coffee, be able to study together quietly a little bit, just kind of low key stuff. Okay, where have you been looking for friends? Well, I go to all the parties. And there's that disconnect between their ideal friend and the people that they're meeting at the parties, for example. And so the question is where, like, and sometimes it can be difficult to answer, but where am I going to find these people? And finally, and this actually shows up in a few pieces of research, a thing that we need to tell ourselves when we're talking about friends and friendships, whether it's further developing our current relationships or developing new ones, this idea that you need to assume that people like you. We get in our own way sometimes, right? Because we've been hurt. And I think it is important to keep in mind there's some very real historical injustice that might be making this difficult for ourselves to recognize that people do like us. However, reminding ourselves, journaling on this, not just journaling, I'm so great because, but just recognizing and giving other people the opportunity, the chance to like us because we are likable is really, really important. And that's something, again, that we can work on for ourselves, that we can help others with if we're noting that they're becoming a bit more lonely. And that, again, as therapists, as counselors, might be useful. So in terms of fast friends, we've got one more question here. Right? This is probably the deepest one, and feel free to share or not share. It's absolutely up to you. But this is kind of a level 3 fast friends question. If you were going to become a close friend with someone, what would be important for them to know? And so again, this isn't just saying, oh, here's my name, here's whatever have you. You can type it in the chat. Feel free not to do that, okay? We're not taking huge risks here on this random internet presentation that you decided to hop on. But if you were going to become a close friend with someone, what would be important for them to know? part of the resources at the end, I've made a link to a PDF of all 36 of the Fast Friends questions. It's used quite a bit in community-based programming. Again, this idea of friend-based kind of speed dating type things. But what would actually be important for someone to know if you're going to become a close friend with someone? So, as I mentioned at the beginning, these are some things that I came up with for my own presentation. That, again, maybe in the chat, feel free as I'm talking through some of these things, some other ideas that you had of things that people can do. So if we're looking to help ourselves, when we're talking about social loneliness, we're looking at those kind of basics around finding a club, finding a group, finding something, those opportunities for us to connect. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have to connect with individual people in those groups, but just doing things, recognizing that there are people out there, right? The idea of micro moments and acts of kindness, you'll see this helps ourselves as well as helping others as well. I can't emphasize enough. Helping others is just such a huge boon to mental health in general. Sometimes it requires us to get over a little bit of a self hurdle, but super important. And sometimes starting just with micro moments is really important. Spending time in nature, great, in so many ways, connection with the environment. Volunteering, again, not necessarily because we're going to be a better person because we volunteer, but because we want to help others or because we want to make friends. And journaling, especially journaling around some of your maybe comparisons to what you think the reality is for other people in loneliness, what you think your relationships are like, just even some free writing around what is currently bugging you or what's missing within the relationship. Sometimes journaling can help us work through that perception component of loneliness around, hey, sometimes it's like, no, that's actually true. Like, this is not a great relationship. I need to maybe look at some new relationships or invest in this relationship in a different way. But sometimes it can also say to us, hey, we can work ourselves through some journaling around, actually, maybe I'm selling this relationship short and I actually have a pretty good relationship there. When it comes to others and helping others, apart from micro moments, kind of acts of kindness and volunteering, most important is be on the lookout. All those things that were protective factors, if people don't have those, it's a possibility that they might experience loneliness at some point, right? And often we're a little self-focused, but again, in person, offline, connecting with someone, even if it is online, just to say, hey, would you like to actually, connect for a coffee or even a Zoom, a little bit more than just a message? Just again, using the internet to help facilitate those in-person connections really important. Community, if you are in such a position that you're able to develop some programming or to help out your community in some way, building or developing some clubs or groups. Again, it could simply be something as simple as just like a social group, that's all you can call it, and just offering the space and the place for it. Mentoring programs, that's a big thing in the UK in particular, looking at especially mentoring between the older generation and the younger generation. So kind of grandparenting, mentoring type programs, those have seen quite a bit of success in helping bolster or counter loneliness in both the younger population and the older population. I mentioned Fast Friends, a number of things, a number of times there. But there could be quite a lot of other programming that maybe you have some ideas about based on what I've been talking about so far. And then finally, in terms of therapists, this certainly is not an exhaustive list. I actually kind of like topped out on this one myself. I was like, I have to get this presentation ready for Nikki. But challenging our clients' perceptions for themselves, taking a good focus on comparisons, not necessarily saying that isn't real, because we do want to normalize and validate that loneliness exists. One of the reasons I started this whole presentation with asking people, how often have you been lonely over the past month, is to normalize. It's okay to be lonely. It is a very human reaction to circumstances that might not be ideal, but it ideally allows us to take some steps, be brave to take some action there, right? And then again, if you're a therapist, maybe working with someone, just kind of gently challenging and looking on, not full on social skills, but looking at, how do you make friends normally, right? Are there some things there that we might be able to touch on? Maybe even just some basic kind of life coaching type thing. Coming to the end here, I've got this big list. Nikki's gonna pop it into the chat. It's gonna be this mega list of these references because I know you won't get these slides immediately. But there are some nice links on it. These are a variety of both some references from which I was drawing some specific things, but also some resources. One other kind of programming thing that is actually kind of cool there, you'll see the third from the bottom there. It's called the Unlonely Film Festival. It's an online repository of free videos that you can watch or that you can maybe create an event around that are all around different facets of being lonely. It really encourages conversation and topics. It's very, very interesting, I find. And just some really, and you see the second to last one there is Fast Friends questions. These are in no particular order. Again, this was like 5 minutes to presentation time that is pulling these in. But feel free to check those out. And I'll pop those up again after this next slide, which is basically my thank you slide. So thank you very, very much. I thought this would take 50 minutes and it's taken 56. So I think that's not too bad at all. If you'd like to get in touch with me, I noticed there's a capital letter there, which doesn't have to be there, but please feel free to reach out. Feel free to copy my email there. Nikki, feel free to put that in the chat as well. I didn't copy it to you, but it's my first name, Freeman.mylastname, woolno@gmail.com. I'm happy to chat about this. Again, please remember, I am not an expert on loneliness, but I'm happy to chat about it, happy to brainstorm some ideas. I love programming and I love working with individual clients. So thank you so much for those of you who've stayed through and have a wonderful, wonderful evening.